Welcome to the Rudick Report. Today is Wednesday, January 4th, 2023. Today I want to touch on two stories. One is the continued commentary on the economy, and the other one is one regarding the green agenda. So first up is the economy. A recent report by the Epoch Times indicates that most large banks and financial institutions surveyed by the Wall Street Journal predict that the United States will fall into the grips of a recession in 2023, and that millions of Americans will lose their jobs. So if we add these predictions to an already failing economy, we now have a recipe for disaster. These financial institutions, including trading firms, investment banks that do business directly with the Federal Reserve, and they expect the U.S. economy to contract in 2023. So it's not just alternative media sounding the alarm now. We have mainstream media barking the recession word. And these institutions that predict the coming recession expect consumer spending to weaken as Americans deplete their savings and tap their credit cards as an aggressive Fed drives up borrowing costs and as banks' lending standards get tighter. With soaring U.S. inflation, which in June 2022 hit a recent peak of 9% in annual terms, as measured by the Consumer Price Index, it has forced the Fed to raise rates at its fastest pace since the 1980s in a desperate bid to relieve price pressures. The aggressive rate increases have so far had only a limited effect, with November CPI data showing inflation still running high at about 7.1%. If we were to use the same methods as the U.S. government used to measure CPI in the 80s, it puts November inflation figure at a much higher 15.2%, which is probably about where it is in reality. And even though inflation has eased somewhat from its June peak, it's far from enough for the Fed to hit the brakes on interest rates, which were brought up quickly from near zero in March of 2022 to the current range of about 4.25% to 4.5%. Frustrated by how high inflation has remained despite the Fed rate increases, officials have pledged to keep raising rates and keep them high until inflation recedes to around the Fed's 2% target. In their most recent summary of economic projections, officials said they expect the terminal Fed funds rate, meaning the highest level before it hits a ceiling and later falls, to come in at about 5.1%. Rates that high would push unemployment up to 4.6% in 2023 from its current 3.7% and stay at that level through 2024. Most of the economists surveyed by Wall Street Journal think unemployment will get even worse and peak at more than 5%. An unemployment rate that high would mean several million Americans would lose their jobs. Prior to 2020, inflation was seen all but tamed, but after COVID-19 hit, as the government and the Fed flooded lockdown businesses and households with trillions of dollars in stimulus and support, the era of low inflation ground to a halt. While the money helped businesses keep workers on payrolls and bolstered consumer spending, it also led to an inflationary jump in demand as supply chains that were crippled by pandemic restrictions couldn't keep up. Idled factories were unable to ratchet up production fast enough to meet the demand, an inflationary dynamic made worse by labor shortages as more people who were close to retirement left the workforce permanently amid the pandemic, and as generous stimulus checks kept others from seeking employment. Inflation in the United States, as measured by the CPI, soared from a pandemic-era low of 0.24% in May of 2020 to a recent peak of 9% in June of 2022. In the face of soaring inflation, central banks across the world have hiked interest rates in a bid to cool demand and relieve price pressures, raising the risk of a recession. The International Monetary Fund said its latest biannual global economic outlook, released in October, said it expected inflation to peak in late 2022, but warned it would remain elevated for longer than previously expected. The international agency expects U.S. inflation to drop to 3.5% this year from 8.1% in 22, but in many other countries it expected to be higher. For instance, inflation in advanced economies in Europe this year is predicted at 6.2%, while emerging economies in Europe are expected to see inflation at a whopping 19.4%. The IMF said in its report that despite projections for lower inflation, overall in 2023 it expects more economic pain. More than a third of the global economy will contract this year, while the three largest economies, the United States, the European Union, and China, will continue to stall, the IMF said in their report. In short, the worst is yet to come for many people in 2023, and it will feel like a recession. Although most people will tell you we're in a recession right now, and if that's the case, which most of us feel, it's just going to get progressively worse. This next story comes out of New York, and it's related to the green agenda. New York's governor legalizes human composting. New York's Governor Kathy Hochul has legalized natural organic reduction, otherwise known as human composting. New York is the sixth state to do so since 2019, and it gives New Yorkers access to an alternative green method of burial deemed environmentally friendly. But the departed may not simply be tossed on the compost heap. Remains must be delivered to a cemetery corporation certified as an organic reduction facility, suitably contained and ventilated, and not containing a battery pack, power cell, radioactive implant, or radioactive device. In most cases, the deceased is placed into a reusable, semi-open vessel containing suitable bedding, which include wood chips, alfalfa, or straw, ideal for microbes to go about their work. At the end of the process, a heaped cubic yard of nutrient-dense soil equivalent to 36 bags of soil is produced that can then be used as fertilizer. Every single thing we can do to turn people away from concrete liners and fancy caskets and embalming, we ought to do and be supportive of, said Michelle Mentor, manager at Green Springs Natural Cemetery Preserve in central New York. Mentor said her business would strongly consider the method. Hochul found herself in a political dilemma over the issue. She said that she is a proud Irish American, and has often spoken about how her Irish Catholic roots influenced her political outlook. Now, I find that a little funny because if a Republican ever stated that their religious background influenced their political decision-making, that would be on the front page news everywhere. But the fact that she's a Democrat, it looks like she can do whatever she wants. The New York State Catholic Conference had encouraged church followers to pressure Hochul to veto the bill. The organization argued that the process does not provide respect due to bodily remains. Dennis Paust, executive director of the organization, said in a statement, "A process that is perfectly appropriate for returning vegetable trimmings to the earth is not necessarily appropriate for human bodies." On the flip side, the advocates urged the governor to commit her signature and offered a series of decorative colored cards reading, "Compost me," and "I want to be a tree," to send on to the governor. Others argued that people want a method of disposition in keeping with how they live their lives. Cremation uses fossil fuels and burials use a lot of land and has a carbon footprint, said Catherine Spade, the founder of Recompose, a green funeral home in Seattle that offers human composting. For a lot of folks, being turned into soil that can be turned to grow into garden or tree is pretty impactful, Spade told the Associated Press. Proponents of human composting say the process is economical as well as environmental, with the body transforming in 6 to 8 weeks. Now, I don't know how you feel about that, but I have a problem with composting human remains and then using it as fertilizer to be spread over our fields where vegetables will grow in, fruits, etc. And then that's brought to the marketplace. I mean, it's one step away from Soylent Green, in my opinion. But it remains to be seen how widespread this becomes. Until next time, this is the Rudick Report.